John Omick was a member of the Massasauga Band of Chippewa, who by the early 1800s were living on the west bank of the Cuyahoga River in what would become Cleveland's most notorious Irish slum, known as the Angle. John Omick was born around 1790. By his early teens, he had a reputation as a boy with an evil disposition and reckless temper. According to Crisfield Johnson, one of Cuyahoga County's first historians, Omick was also a hardy and athletic Native American youth who committed unspecified crimes. However, Mrs. David Long, the wife of Cleveland's first physician, knew Omick and his father and played with him during her childhood. She recalled that Omick was not a bad Indian towards the whites. Major Lorenzo Carter was a leading citizen of Cleveland. His house was located northwest of what is now the intersection of Superior Avenue and West 9th Street. In 1805, a 15-year-old John walked uninvited into Carter's vegetable garden and began harvesting the produce for himself. When Mrs. Carter discovered him, she was outraged. John drew his knife and chased her 3 times around her house. When another white man arrived, John fled to his home on the west side of the river. The formidable Major Carter did not tolerate such acts upon his family. After acquiring an adequate length of rope, he promptly went to the home of Omick the Elder, John's father, situated on the other side of the winding Cuyahoga River. Major Carter informed Omick about his son's wrongdoing and then revealed the rope, stating that he intended to track down his son and hang him from the first available tree. Eventually, Omick managed to persuade Carter against his dreadful plan by promising that John would never again visit the east side by crossing the river. On April 3, 1812, the remains of 2 white fur trappers named Daniel Buel and Michael Gibbs were discovered in the ashes of their burned cabin near Sandusky. They had been killed for their furs, and their cabin was set ablaze with them inside. The search for the perpetrators led to the capture of 3 Cherokee Indians hiding in the Maumee swamp area. One was released due to his youth, and the second, named Simo, killed himself with a firearm. As a result, John Omick was the last captive left to the mercy of frontier justice. As Huron County then remained part of Cuyahoga County's judicial realm, Omick was removed to Major Clark's home in Cleveland, where he was confined in an upper room using leg irons attached to a joist. The trial of Omick was held on April 29th at Superior and Water Streets, a short formality that took place under a tree. Omick was defended by Peter Hitchcock and prosecuted by Alfred Kelly, with William W. Irvin and Ethan Allen Brown serving as judges. The stolen furs were found in Omick's possession when he was caught, and he had no co-defendants on whom he could turn the state's evidence, so Omick was quickly found guilty of Buell's murder and sentenced to death on June 26, 1812.
The quaint indictment charging Omick with the murders read in part that
John Omick, being a person of sound mentality and discretion, not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, was responsible for the murders of Daniel Buel and Michael Gibbs. John Omick is to be hung on the 26th of June, 1812, between the hours of 12 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Rumors of violent Indian plots to rescue him were widespread throughout the Western Reserve, and white fears peaked one afternoon, shortly before the execution, when John Omick's father walked into the house of Dr. David Long on Water Street. The only people there were Mrs. Long and her infant daughter. Mrs. Long became frightened when the elder Omick picked up a gun in the room. Grabbing her baby, Mrs. Long fled in terror up Water Street, screaming that she was about to be attacked by Indians. Close behind her was old Omick, trying to explain in imperfect English that he had only been trying to demonstrate how Simo, his son's unfortunate Confederate, had met his death. Eventually, Major Carter, who spoke Indian languages fluently, resolved the situation. Mrs. Long later recalled that they all had a hearty laugh over her misunderstanding. The long-awaited day finally arrived. It began with a religious ceremony conducted by Reverend Darrow of Trumbull County in front of Major Carter's house. The main event of the day started with Omick's arrival at the gallows, which were set up by Deputy Sheriff Levi Johnson, who also served as the Cuyahoga County coroner in the northwest quadrant of Public Square. Omick was escorted there in a black painted wagon, accompanied by Major Samuel Jones and his battalion of militia. It is said that Omick spent his time in the wagon bed tapping on the side of his coffin to the rhythm of the tunes played that morning by the militia band. If this is true, he must have enjoyed a lengthy musical performance, as Major Clark's inability to give clear or correct orders to his troops greatly delayed the progress of the day's dreadful protocol. In any case, by the time the critical moment arrived, a large crowd gathered from all over the reserve had assembled to witness the execution of Omick. During his time in custody, Omick had frequently boasted that he would show the pale faces how an Indian could die by cheerfully hurling himself to eternity at the proper time. Alas, Omick's calm demeanor disappeared at the critical moment. Accompanied to the gallows by Major Carter and Sheriff Samuel S. Baldwin, Omick remained passive until the traditional black cap was placed over his head. However, overwhelmed by panic, Omick, whose hands were loosely tied, made a sudden lunge for one of the uprights of the square gallows. Elisha Whittlesey, an eyewitness, later described him as the most terrified man, rational or irrational, that Whittlesey had ever seen. Clinging desperately to his gallows post, he refused to let go until Major Carter promised him courage and agreed to give him half a pint of whiskey. After drinking the whiskey, Omick stood still as the black cap was placed over his head once more. Just before the signal to open the drop came, he lunged for the safety of the uprights again and clung to them tightly, shouting threats in broken English that he would return in 2 days to take revenge on his white tormentors. Another tense conversation with Major Carter followed. Another half pint of old Monongahela was given to Omick, and he again drank the soothing liquid and repeated his vows to face his death bravely. This time, however, Carter was taking no chances, and while Sheriff Baldwin bound his arms tighter this time, the second glass was held to the terrified Indian's lips. But Omick wasn't about to give up just yet. Even as the floor dropped beneath him, he somehow managed to get his right hand free and slip it between the rope and his neck. Not that it did him much good. He released the length of the rope, swung back and forth several times, and then was still. Upon examination, it was determined that Omick's neck had not been broken, indicating his demise came from slow strangulation instead. One spectator who failed to witness the final act of Omick's life was childhood friend Mrs. David Long, who decided at the last minute that she had no wish to see my old playfellow die, and fled the grim scene at Public Square. A severe thunderstorm was brewing, so the decision was made to quickly bury Omick. But as the hangman's rope was drawn up, it broke, and Omick's body fell to the ground. The first drops of rain began to fall as Omick was hastily buried in a shallow grave, and the crowd quickly dispersed. However, the story doesn't end there. Almost every physician in the Western Reserve was present that day, and it is said that every single one of them wanted to dissect Omick's body. While Sheriff Baldwin turned a blind eye, Omick's body was dug up by a group of interested physicians. Dr. Peter Allen of Trumbull County volunteered to carry Omick's body, but he couldn't handle the weight and fell in the middle of the street with the dead Indian on top of him. There was reportedly some muffled laughter, but the body was eventually taken away and left to decompose in a temporary grave near Spring Street. It remained there for a year until Dr. Long retrieved it. It's rumored that he used it for several years as a practical tool for teaching Western Reserve physicians.
Sometime later, it made its way to Dr. Israeltown's office in Hudson, and then to Pittsburgh, where it disappeared forever, but not before further disturbing one more frightened white man. There is a story that a certain Captain Scholes was put to bed with the ague while stopping one evening at Dr. Long's house. Awakening to a loud sound in the middle of the night, Captain Scholes looked over the side of his bed to find himself staring at the disturbing remains of the late John Omick, which had just fallen out of a cupboard onto the floor. It is said that Mrs. Long apologized fervently to her frightened guest.
Not long after the hanging, Major Carter, fearing an act of revenge facilitated by John Omick's father and his tribe, led a party of whites who ended up kidnapping the old man, getting him soused on old Monongahela whiskey, weighted him with irons, and drowning him in the cover of the night in the Cuyahoga River. The first experiment in capital punishment in Cuyahoga County concluded with the execution of John Omick. It is believed that Omick's execution influenced Indians to favor the British side in the War of 1812, as news of the war reached Cleveland just 2 days after Omick's death. It is possible that Omick's gruesome end was what the Ohio General Assembly had in mind when, in 1885, it required that executions be private. This was because they believed that public executions had damaging effects on spectators.